The official transcript shows I read the all clear at 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. It shows my voice steady, my cadence professional, my sign-off warm. It does not show that I knew, by 4:39 a.m., that the all clear was wrong. It does not show that I read it anyway. I want to be honest about that before anything else, because everything that came after grew out of those 8 minutes. And I've spent the years since trying to understand what kind of person sits in a small lit room and tells a sleeping city it is safe when he already suspects it is not. My name does not matter for this. What matters is that for 9 years, I was a duty announcer at a municipal emergency information station, the kind of small operation most people never think about until the night they need it. We were not a commercial radio outlet. We did not play music. We did not take calls. We were one of 3 secondary nodes in the regional alert system, the layer underneath the federal warnings, the layer that handled the local detail the federal system was too broad to carry. Boil water notices, chemical releases at the rail yard, road closures during ice storms, shelter-in-place instructions when the wind shifted wrong across the industrial corridor. We broadcast on a low-frequency band. We fed the weather radios in every kitchen and every nursing home. And we ran the text crawl on the public access channel that nobody watched except during emergencies, when suddenly everybody did. The studio was on the 7th floor of a county building that had been a courthouse before it was anything else. The elevator only went to the 6th. To reach us, you took the service stairs at the end of the hallway, unlocked a fire door with a key the size of a small wrench, and climbed one more flight into what had once been a judge's private chambers. Somebody in the 70s had ripped out the wood paneling and put in acoustic foam in a console. The window had been bricked over for soundproofing. There was a single exterior door that opened onto a tar roof, sealed with a panic bar that triggered an alarm if you pushed it from the inside without a code. That door and the stairs were the only ways in or out. I worked the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 4 nights on, 3 nights off. The rotation alternating with 2 other announcers I rarely saw because the handoffs were staggered. Most nights I read maybe 4 bulletins, a lost child, a water main. The kind of routine that, after the first year, stops feeling like emergency work and starts feeling like the slowest job in the county. I drank coffee from a thermos my wife had filled before she left me, and after she left me, I kept using the thermos because buying a new one felt like admitting something. I read paperbacks between bulletins. I watched the small monitor that showed the rail yard cameras, because the rail yard was the most dangerous thing in our broadcast area. And the cameras were a courtesy feed from the company that operated it. I watched the weather radar. I waited. The system I worked inside was called CIVAS, the County Integrated Verification and Alert System. It was old. The core software had been written in 1998 and patched so many times that the patches had patches. The way it worked, in plain language, was this: a sensor somewhere in the field, a hydrogen sulfide detector at the rail yard, a flow meter at the reservoir, a seismometer near the dam, would trip a threshold. The trip would generate a code. The code would arrive at our console as a flashing line of text and a tone. I would cross-reference the code in a binder we kept on a metal stand beside the chair. The binder told me which pre-written script to read, which alert level to assign, and which downstream systems would receive the broadcast automatically. The weather radios, the cable crawl, the siren network on the west side of town, which the federal layer didn't cover. There was a verification step, which was that I was supposed to call a number at the originating agency and confirm the trip was real before I read the script. If I couldn't reach anyone within 90 seconds, I was authorized to broadcast anyway, on the assumption that a real emergency was more dangerous than a false alarm. I want you to understand how rarely the verification step mattered. In 9 years, I had read perhaps 200 bulletins. Of those, maybe 8 were genuine emergencies. The rest were sensor glitches, scheduled tests, or low-threshold events that didn't really need a broadcast, but the binder said to read one anyway. The verification calls almost always went through on the first ring, and the person on the other end almost always said yes, it's real, read it, or no, it's a false trip, stand down. I had developed, without meaning to, a particular kind of confidence in the system. Not the confidence that it worked well, the confidence that it worked predictably. I knew its rhythms. I knew which sensors lied. I knew which agencies answered their phones at 3 a.m. and which ones I'd have to leave a voicemail for and broadcast anyway. I knew, or thought I knew, what the room sounded like when something real was happening. On the Tuesday I'm talking about, the room sounded wrong from the moment I came on shift. The handoff from the evening announcer, a woman named Ileana, was usually a 30-second conversation. She'd tell me what had cleared during her shift, sign the log, and leave. That night, she was already standing at the door with her coat on when I came up the stairs. She'd written her handoff notes on a sticky note instead of the log. She said the rail yard had thrown 3 low-threshold trips during the evening, all of them sub-alarm, all of them self-clearing. She said she'd called the yard twice and gotten the same dispatcher both times, a man she didn't recognize, who told her the sensors were being recalibrated and to disregard. She said she'd noted it in the log, but hadn't escalated because the trips never crossed the broadcast threshold. She said the dispatcher had sounded tired. Then she said, and I remember this because it was unusual for her, that the building had felt cold all evening. The HVAC in our part of the 7th floor was independent from the rest of the building on its own thermostat, and Ileana liked it warm. She'd cranked it up twice and it hadn't responded. She said she thought maybe a vent was stuck. She said it like she was apologizing for mentioning it. I told her I'd check the vent. She left. I locked the fire door behind her, which was protocol, and I climbed the last flight to the studio and sat down at the console and looked at the logs she'd left. 3 sub-alarm trips at the rail yard, spaced about 40 minutes apart. The codes were for the hydrogen sulfide detectors at the east end of the yard, near the tank farm where they transferred liquid product from rail cars to truck trailers. Sub-alarm meant the sensors had detected something, but at a level below what the binder called actionable. The system was designed that way on purpose. Hydrogen sulfide is heavy. It pools. A sensor at chest height might read low, while a sensor at ankle height read high. And you didn't want to broadcast a shelter-in-place every time a rail car burped during a transfer. The threshold existed to filter out noise. 3 trips in an evening was high, but not unprecedented. I had seen 5 in a night during a bad transfer cycle 2 summers earlier. What I hadn't seen, and what I noticed when I scrolled back through the console log, was that the trips were occurring in a pattern, not random. The east sensors first, then the central sensors, then the west sensors, in sequence, as if something were moving across the yard. I made the verification call. The yard dispatcher answered on the second ring. He confirmed what Ileana had been told. Recalibration. Disregard. He had the slightly clipped, slightly bored tone of somebody who'd been answering the same question for hours. I asked him who was on site doing the recalibration. He said a contractor crew. I asked which contractor. He paused for maybe half a second and said he didn't have the paperwork in front of him, but he could call me back. I said, "Don't worry about it." I logged the call. I hung up. The pause was the first thing I should not have ignored. I knew the rail yard dispatchers. I knew the way they talked. They did not pause when you asked them basic questions, because basic questions were 90% of their job, and the answers were always on a clipboard within arm's reach. He paused because he didn't have an answer. He didn't have an answer because there was no contractor. I knew this, in the way you know things you don't want to know, sitting in that small lit room at 10:15 at night. I knew it, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself an Ileana would have escalated if she'd really thought something was wrong. I told myself the binder didn't tell me to do anything. And the binder was the whole reason I had a job. I sat with my thermos and I waited for the next trip. It came at 11:04. East sensors again. Sub-alarm. Self-cleared in under a minute. I did not call the yard. The binder did not require it for a sub-alarm clear. I logged it. At 11:50, central sensors. Sub-alarm, self-cleared. At 12:31, west sensors. Sub-alarm, self-cleared. The pattern had repeated itself. The thing in the yard, whatever it was, had crossed once and was crossing again. I sat in the chair and I looked at the rail yard cameras. The cameras were not high quality. They showed the access roads and the main transfer pad in low light gray. I could see the lights of the office at the south end, where the dispatcher was sitting. I could see the silhouettes of tank cars on the east siding. I could not see anything moving. There was nothing to see, because hydrogen sulfide is invisible. And if it was a leak, what I would see was the absence of anything wrong. The HVAC clicked on. The studio was cold. Ileana had been right. I went to the vent in the corner and held my hand under it. The air coming out was warm. The thermostat read 61 degrees. I looked at the door to the roof. The panic bar was set. The alarm was armed. The door fit tightly into its frame. I told myself the cold was the building, an old building full of drafts. At 1:15, the federal layer pushed a routine test through our system. I acknowledged it. The test ran clean. I logged it. At 1:42, the rail yard threw a fourth trip. East sensors, not sub-alarm, actionable. The console flashed amber and the tone played, a low double note that I had heard maybe a dozen times in my career, and that always made the back of my neck tighten. The binder script for an actionable hydrogen sulfide release at the east end of the rail yard was a shelter-in-place advisory for the 3 residential blocks immediately downwind, plus a warning to the trucking company that fed the yard, plus an automatic dispatch to the county fire response team. I went to the binder. I opened it to the right tab. I picked up the verification phone. The yard dispatcher did not answer. I let it ring 15 times. I hung up. I called back. 20 rings. I hung up. I called the secondary number, which was the yard supervisor's cell. It went straight to voicemail. I called the tertiary number, which was the regional operations desk for the rail company, located 300 miles away. A woman answered. I told her who I was and what I was seeing. She put me on hold. I watched the console. The amber light kept flashing. The 90-second window for verification was almost gone. She came back on. She said she had no information about an event at our yard. She said her board showed all sensors normal. I said, "Your board shows what?" She said all sensors normal. Green across. I looked at my console. Amber. East sensors at actionable threshold. I asked her to read me the sensor IDs she was seeing. She read me a list. They were the same IDs as mine. Her board said green. Mine said amber. The 90-second window closed while she was reading. The console automatically prompted me to broadcast. The script was on the screen. I had a finger on the broadcast key. I did not press it. I want to be very clear about what I did and did not do in that moment, because I have spent years rebuilding it in my head, and I am still not sure my reconstruction is honest. I did not press the key because the regional operations desk was telling me her board was green, and her board was the authoritative board. And if I broadcast a shelter-in-place that turned out to be a sensor malfunction on our end, I would be the announcer who woke 3 residential blocks at 2 in the morning over nothing. I had been trained to broadcast anyway. The protocol existed precisely for this situation. The situation where verification fails and the safe thing to do is assume the alarm is real. I knew the protocol. I had read it dozens of times. I did not follow it. I told the woman on the phone I needed to call her back. I hung up. I called the yard dispatcher again. No answer. I called the supervisor's cell again. Voicemail. I sat there with my finger off the key, and I watched the amber light flash, and I told myself that one more verification attempt was reasonable, that the protocol allowed for it, that the broadcast could still go out within 5 minutes and still be useful. At 1:46, the console cleared itself. The amber light went out. The sensors had self-reset. The console logged it as a transient event. I exhaled. I remember exhaling. I remember the specific feeling of relief. And I remember being aware, even as I felt it, that the relief was disproportionate. That it was the relief of a man who had been spared a difficult decision rather than the relief of a man who had learned the danger was not real. I logged the event. I noted that verification had failed at the yard and succeeded at the regional desk, and that the regional desk had reported green. I did not note that I had been frozen with my finger off the broadcast key for the entire 90-second window. The log did not ask for that. The log only asked for what had happened on the console. The studio was very cold. I went to the small bathroom at the back of the studio, a closet really, with a sink and a toilet and a vent fan that hadn't worked in years. I splashed water on my face. The water came out lukewarm and tasted like metal, the way it always did from that tap. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like a man who had not slept properly in 3 months. I told myself the relief was justified, that the sensors had cleared, that the regional desk's green board was the truth, and our amber board was the lie, and that whatever was happening at the yard was a calibration problem and nothing more. At 2:11, the east sensors tripped again. Sub-alarm this time, self-cleared. At 2:33, central sensors, sub-alarm. At 2:58, west sensors, sub-alarm. The pattern had repeated for the 3rd time. Whatever was moving across the yard had crossed 3 times in 5 hours. I sat in the chair, and I tried to imagine what would do that. A leak from a single car would not move. A vapor cloud would drift with the wind and not return. The only thing I could think of that would cross and recross a yard in a pattern was a person. A person walking through the yard, opening valves, closing them, walking to the next section. Or several people, a crew. The yard dispatcher had said a contractor crew. I tried the dispatcher's number again. No answer. I tried the supervisor's cell. Voicemail. I tried the regional desk. The same woman answered. I asked her casually whether there was any scheduled work at our yard tonight. She said no. I asked her whether there could be unscheduled work, a contractor crew brought in for a recalibration without a work order. She paused. She said that would be unusual. She said she would check and call me back. She did not call me back. I sat in the studio and I watched the rail yard cameras. I could see the office light at the south end. I watched it for a long time. I was looking for movement, for somebody walking past the window, for the dispatcher to come outside and stretch the way they sometimes did during long shifts. I did not see anyone. The light was on. The office was empty, or someone was inside it who was not moving. I want to stop here and tell you about my wife, because if I don't, the next part will not make sense. She had left in February, 8 months before that Tuesday. She had not left because of anything dramatic. She had left because I had become, in her words, a person who waited. A person whose entire professional identity was built around sitting in a room and waiting for bad things to happen to other people. And who had brought that posture home, into our kitchen, into our bed. She said she could feel me waiting all the time, waiting for her to leave, waiting for some catastrophe to give my attention somewhere to land. She said she didn't want to be the catastrophe, and she didn't want to be the thing I was waiting through. She moved to her sister's place in a town 2 hours south. We had not divorced. We had not really talked. She had sent me a text on my birthday in August that said, "Happy birthday. Take care of yourself." And I had read it 40 times and written 6 different replies and not sent any of them. The reason this matters is that her sister's town was downwind of the rail yard. Not directly downwind. The prevailing wind that time of year was out of the north-northwest, and her sister's town was south-southeast. But it was within the model dispersion zone for a major release from the East Tank Farm. I had seen the dispersion maps. They were in a different binder, the planning binder, the one we only opened during annual drills. I had read them carefully the first year we did the drill, because she had just moved there and I had wanted to know. The map showed concentric ovals, the inner ones marked for evacuation, the outer ones for shelter in place, the outermost for monitor and report. Her sister's house was in the outer shelter-in-place oval, on a release of the maximum modeled magnitude. I sat in the studio at 3 in the morning, and I thought about the dispersion map. I thought about my wife, asleep in a guest room, in a small house, in a town she had moved to, in order to get away from me. I thought about her phone on the nightstand, set to receive weather radio alerts, the way every phone in our broadcast area was set, because we had pushed that policy hard in our public outreach. If I broadcast a shelter in place, her phone would wake her. She would close the windows. She would tape the doors. She would do the things I had spent 9 years telling people to do. If I did not broadcast, she would sleep. I tried the yard dispatcher again. No answer. I tried the supervisor. Voicemail. I tried the regional desk. The phone rang and went to a recorded message saying the operations desk was experiencing high call volume and to leave a message. I did not leave a message. At 3:22, the east sensors tripped to actionable. The amber light, the tone, the script on the screen. I went to the binder. The script for a shelter in place was already loaded. I had 8 minutes from the trip before the federal layer would notice we hadn't broadcast and start asking questions. I had 90 seconds before the protocol required me to broadcast on the failed verification rule. I picked up the phone. I called the yard. No answer. I called the supervisor. Voicemail. I called the regional desk. High call volume. I called the county fire response team's overnight line, which was not part of my normal verification chain, but which I had on a sticky note under my keyboard from a drill 2 years earlier. A man answered. I told him who I was. I told him I had an actionable hydrogen sulfide reading at the East Tank Farm, and I could not raise the yard. I asked him whether his sensors were showing anything. He said his team did not have sensors at the yard. His team had a radio link to the yard dispatcher, who he had been unable to reach for the last 2 hours. He said he had assumed the dispatcher was on a long break. I said 2 hours. He said yes. He said it was unusual but not unheard of, especially during light traffic nights, and he had not escalated because there had been no alarms. I said there had been alarms, sub-alarm trips, a pattern. There was a long silence on the line. He said, "Where are you reading the actionable trip?" I said, "East Tank Farm." I said the threshold had been crossed and the system was prompting me to broadcast a shelter-in-place advisory for the 3 downwind residential blocks. He said, "Broadcast it." I said the regional desk was showing green. He said, "I don't care what the regional desk is showing. Broadcast it. I will get a crew to the yard." I should have broadcast it then. I had verification of a kind. I had a county fire officer telling me to push the button. The protocol allowed for that. The protocol practically demanded it. I had a finger on the broadcast key for the second time that night. What I did instead was ask him one more question, and the question was the one I have replayed more than any other in the years since. I asked him whether he could get a crew to the yard within 15 minutes and confirm a real release before I broadcast. I told him I wanted to avoid a false alarm. I told him the regional desk's green reading was bothering me. I told him I was the only one on shift and that a false shelter in place at 3 in the morning would have political consequences for our station that we might not survive. He paused. He said 15 minutes was tight but possible. He said he would send a 2-person crew with SCBA and meters. He said don't broadcast until I hear from him. I said okay. I hung up. The amber light kept flashing. The 90-second window closed. The console logged a failed verification timeout and prompted me again to broadcast under the failed verification rule. I dismissed the prompt. The console logged the dismissal. This is the part of the log I've read most carefully, because it is the part that, if anyone had ever looked, would have been the evidence against me. The dismissal was time-stamped. The reason field was blank. I could have written anything. I could have written awaiting field verification per county fire officer. I could have written deferring under operational discretion. I did not write anything. I left it blank. The log accepted the blank. The system did not require a reason. The system required only a click. At 3:37, the east sensors cleared. At 3:38, the central sensors tripped to actionable. The pattern was crossing again. Whatever it was, it had not stopped. It had moved west. The script in the binder for a central yard release was different from the east script. It expanded the shelter-in-place zone to include a 4th residential block and a small commercial corridor with a 24-hour diner and a gas station that was usually open. I went to the binder. I loaded the new script. I picked up the phone. I called the county fire officer back. He did not answer. I called the number he had given me for his dispatch. A different man answered. I asked for the officer by name. The dispatch said he was on a call in the field. I said I needed to speak to him about the yard. The dispatch said he was at the yard. I said, "Put me through." The dispatch said he couldn't. The officer was on foot, and his radio was set to crew channel, not dispatch. I asked when he had arrived at the yard. The dispatch said about 4 minutes ago. I said, "Is he okay?" The dispatch said, "As far as I know." The central sensors stated actionable for 2 minutes. Then they cleared. Then the west sensors tripped to actionable. The thing was still moving. I called the dispatch again. I asked whether they had heard from the crew. The dispatch said no. I asked whether that was normal. The dispatch said the crew had been on the ground for 6 minutes, and standard radio check was at 10. I said, "Please tell them to check in immediately." The dispatch said they could not break protocol on my request. The dispatch said the officer would call me at the 10-minute mark. The 10-minute mark passed. The west sensors cleared at 3:51. The east sensors tripped to actionable again at 3:53. The pattern had reversed. The thing was coming back. I called the dispatch. I said, "Have you heard from the crew?" The dispatch said no. I said, "It has been 12 minutes." The dispatch said yes. The dispatch's voice was different now, tighter. I said, "Please send another crew." The dispatch said they were already mobilizing one. The dispatch said the original officer had not responded to 2 radio checks. The dispatch said they were treating it as a possible crew down situation. The dispatch said I should broadcast. I should broadcast. That was when I understood, fully and without any more room for denial, that I had been wrong all night. Not wrong in my readings, wrong in my waiting. Whatever was at the yard had taken a county fire officer and his partner inside of 12 minutes, and the sensors were still tripping. And the dispersion model said the cloud, if there was a cloud, was already moving toward the 3 residential blocks and toward the diner and toward further out, the outer shelter-in-place oval where my wife was asleep 2 hours south. I went to the console. The script was loaded. I put my finger on the broadcast key. I did not press it. I want to tell you that I hesitated because of some final verification doubt, some last principled concern about false alarms and political consequences. That would not be true. I hesitated because I had just realized that if I broadcast now, the log would show that I had dismissed the failed verification prompt at 3:23 and had not broadcast until almost 4. The log would show 35 minutes of delay. The log would show, by inference, that I had known and waited. There would be an investigation. There would always be an investigation after an event of that size. The investigation would read my log and would ask why the reason field was blank, and why I had deferred broadcast on the word of a single county fire officer instead of following the protocol. If I broadcast now, my career was over, possibly worse than over. There were criminal statutes around emergency broadcasting that I had only the vaguest understanding of, but I knew they existed, and I knew that announcers had been prosecuted before for reckless broadcasts and for failures to broadcast, and that the second category was the harder one to defend. If I did not broadcast, and the event resolved without casualties, my log would show a series of sensor anomalies, and a failed verification, and an announcer using operational discretion. It would not be a good log, but it would not be a prosecution. If I did not broadcast, and the event resolved with casualties, the log would show the same thing, and someone would die, and I would know. I sat in the chair. The amber light flashed. The 90-second window opened and closed again. The console prompted me to broadcast. I dismissed the prompt. I left the reason field blank. At 4:06, the dispatch called me back. The second crew was on site. The first crew was down, both unconscious near the East Tank Farm. Recovered by the second crew, evac to the hospital underway. The dispatch said the sensors were reading high across the yard now, not just at the trip points. The dispatch said a release was confirmed. Source unknown. Possibly a sabotage transfer line. Possibly something else. The dispatch said broadcast the shelter in place immediately. The dispatch said the cloud was moving south. I broadcast. I did not broadcast the shelter in place. I broadcast the all clear. I want to be very precise about this, because the official transcript shows what I broadcast, and the official transcript is correct. At 4:47 a.m., I broadcast a sensor anomaly all clear. The script we used after a series of false trips. The script that told the public there had been a system test and no action was required. I had loaded it into the console at 4:15, after the dispatch's call. after I had sat for 9 minutes with my hands on the desk and not moved. I had loaded it because I had decided, in those 9 minutes, that the only log that would protect me was the one that showed a confident announcer dismissing a series of anomalies as the noise they had originally appeared to be. The shelter in place would have been a confession. The all clear was a denial. The all clear was the lie that made the previous 3 hours look like competence. I read it at 4:47. My voice was steady. The transcript notes my cadence as professional, my sign-off as warm. The federal layer received the all clear and stood down whatever escalation it had been preparing. The weather radios in every kitchen and every nursing home in our broadcast area played a soft tone, and then my voice telling everyone they were safe. The cable crawl scrolled the same message. The sirens on the west side, which had been one button away from arming, stayed dark. At 4:53, the dispatch called me, screaming. I did not pick up. The call went to the studio's voicemail, which I had never used because the studio did not receive calls in the normal sense. I sat in the chair, and I let the phone ring. The amber light had cleared. The console showed all sensors green. The release at the yard, whatever it had been, had either dispersed or moved past the sensors. The pattern had stopped. The dispatch called 9 times. I did not pick up. At 5:15, the supervisor's number called me, his cell, the one that had gone to voicemail all night. I did not pick up. At 5:22, a number I did not recognize called me. I did not pick up. At 5:48, the morning announcer arrived for her shift, and I handed off as if nothing had happened. I told her there had been some sensor noise at the yard. All resolved. Log was clean. I told her the building had been cold, and she should check the vent. I left. I walked down the service stairs to the 6th floor and took the elevator to the lobby and walked out into a morning that was just beginning to be light. The air smelled normal. The wind was out of the north-northwest, the way the prevailing wind almost always was that time of year, carrying whatever had been at the yard away from the residential blocks and toward the open farmland to the south. The dispersion model had been built for the worst case. The actual wind that night had been kind. 3 people had been hospitalized. The 2 fire crew members and a night watchman from a warehouse adjacent to the yard who had walked outside for a cigarette at 3:40 and had been found, conscious but disoriented, by the 2nd crew. All 3 recovered. The news the next day reported a chemical release at the yard. Source attributed to a faulty transfer valve. Response handled by county fire. No public alert necessary because the release had dispersed without reaching residential areas. The news did not mention my broadcast because my broadcast was not news. The all clear had been routine. The public had slept through everything. My wife called me that evening. She had heard about the release on the news and had wanted to make sure I was all right. We had not spoken in 8 months. She asked me how I was. I told her I was fine. She asked me whether the station had handled it. I told her we had. She said she was glad. She said the news had said no public alert was necessary. And she had been grateful for that, because she'd been sleeping badly and an alert would have wrecked her week. She laughed a little when she said it. She said her sister's house had old windows and tape never quite sealed them right. I told her I was glad too. We talked for maybe 4 minutes. She did not ask me anything else about the yard. She said, "Take care of yourself," the way she had in August. I said, "You too." We hung up. There was an investigation eventually, not a real one. The rail company conducted an internal review and concluded that the transfer valve had been improperly maintained and that the contractor crew Ileana had been told about had never existed. That the yard dispatcher who had taken her call had been impersonating a recalibration in order to cover for the fact that he had been asleep at his desk and had missed the early warnings. He was fired. The supervisor was reprimanded. The regional desk's green board was attributed to a known software bug between the rail company's monitoring system and the county's sensor feed. A bug that had been documented for 2 years and never patched. The county opened a procurement to replace the CIVAS software. My station was not implicated because my log showed a clean handling of a series of sensor anomalies and a justified all clear after the anomalies cleared. The investigators did not look at the dismissed prompts. The investigators did not look at the blank reason fields. The system had not required them to, and so they were not flagged. I kept my job. I worked the overnight shift for another 2 years. I read maybe 400 more bulletins. None of them were like that night. I left the station a few months after my wife filed for divorce, which she did the following spring, citing irreconcilable differences and asking for nothing. I moved to a town in a different state, where I now work in a warehouse, on a forklift, on a day shift. The work is loud and physical, and it does not require me to wait for anything. I sleep better than I used to. Not well, but better. I have thought many times about what would have happened if I had broadcast the shelter in place at 3:22 when the protocol first told me to. The dispersion model says the cloud would have reached the residential blocks around 4:15, at a concentration below the lethal threshold, but above the threshold for serious respiratory injury, especially in elderly and very young people. The 3 blocks contained, by census, about 420 residents. If I had broadcast, the residents would have closed their windows and stayed inside, and the cloud would have passed over them, and they would have woken up to a news story about a release that had been managed well. None of them would have known how close it had been. I have thought about what would have happened if the wind had shifted. The actual wind that night was kind. The wind shifts. I think about the year before, when the wind shifted twice in a single overnight shift during a different event, and how I had marveled at it then as an example of how unpredictable weather could be. I think about my wife's sister's house and the old windows that tape did not seal. I think about the 420 residents. I do not think about the 3 people who were hospitalized very often. They were the ones I almost killed by waiting, and they survived. And they are the part of the story that I can almost forgive myself for. The part I cannot forgive is the all clear. The fire officer and his partner had already been pulled out by the time I read it. The watchman had been recovered. There was no one left in active danger by 4:47. The all clear did not kill anyone. The all clear was not, in the technical sense, an act of harm. It was an act of cleanup. It was me washing the log. But the city heard it. The city heard my voice at 4:47 telling them they were safe. And the city trusted my voice. Because for 9 years, my voice had been the voice that told them when to worry and when not to worry. And they had no way of knowing that on that one morning, my voice was protecting me and not them. The trust was the same. The voice was the same. The lie was inside the voice, and the voice carried it into every kitchen and every nursing home and every car driving to an early shift. And the people who heard it folded it into the rest of their morning and went on with their lives. That is the part I cannot stop thinking about. Not the danger, the trust. The way a system that depends on a calm voice in a small lit room depends, ultimately, on the integrity of the person sitting in that room, and the way that integrity is not protected by any binder or protocol or verification chain, because all of those things can be dismissed with a click that requires no reason. The system trusted me to fill in the reason field honestly. The system trusted me to broadcast when the protocol said broadcast. The system trusted me, and the city trusted the system. And at the bottom of that chain of trust was a tired man with a thermos who had been left by his wife and who could not stand the idea of his log showing that he had failed. I read the news from that area sometimes, not often. The station I worked at was decommissioned 3 years after I left, replaced by a fully automated system that pulls from federal feeds and broadcasts pre-recorded scripts without a human announcer. The local paper ran a small piece about it. The piece said the automation would eliminate the possibility of human error during overnight events. The piece was written by someone who did not understand that human error and human judgment are the same substance, and that removing one removes the other. And that on the night I broadcast the all clear, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. And the thing that failed was me. I want to end this by saying something useful, but I don't know what it would be. I am not asking for forgiveness, because nobody who would listen to this knows what they would be forgiving. I am not warning anyone, because the system I worked inside no longer exists in the same form. I am telling this because I've been carrying it for a long time, and because telling it is the closest thing I have to filling in the blank reason field that I left empty that night. The reason was fear. The reason was a marriage that had ended, and a log that I wanted to look clean, and a finger that would not press a key, because pressing it would have meant admitting I had waited too long. The city trusted our broadcast. I knew it was a lie. I read it anyway. The wind was kind. That is the whole story, and it is the only one I have. And I have told it now. And I will go back to the warehouse in the morning and drive the forklift and not wait for anything.